Good evening, everyone. I'm Todd Lefko. I'm chairperson of the East-West Connect. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the Russian Studies Department of Macalester College, the Museum of Russian Art, Global Minnesota, and a special thanks to our technical genius, Sergei Kuznetsov, who's saved us on many occasions, and thank God tonight also, and to Catherine Galligan, who is our contact with the rest of the world. Tonight, our moderator and discussant will be the wonderful Bernadine Joslin, who is a diplomat, and one of the truly great minds in nonprofit management, and vice chairman of East-West Connect. She will introduce our wonderful guest, Anastasia Dell. And so Bernadine, пожалуйста, it's yours.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you. Hello, welcome everyone. Gee, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so happy to bring with you an hour of conversation and reflection with our guest Anastasia Edel for our program tonight on how Putin's war on Ukraine is reshaping Russia's relationship with the West. As Todd said, my name is Bernadine Joslin, and I'm privileged to be a board member of East-West Connect. And we've, in this time of responding to the invasion that we've seen, we're really pleased to bring to our audience here in Minnesota and across the United States and across the world, a conversation tonight with Anastasia, who is a Russian-born American author and social historian. Anastasia grew up in a small town in southern Russia during the last years of the Soviet Union. She graduated with a degree in English and German languages from Kubansky State University in Krasnodar in the south, received an award, a scholarship to go to England for postgraduate studies. And she came then to the United States. She's now living in Los Angeles with her family. And after earning her Master's of Fine Arts in Writing from Pacific University, she's now authoring and has authored writing a new book, but she's the acclaimed author. And I wanted to point this out for audience in case you wanted to look into this book afterwards. A 2016 book called Russia, Putin's Playground, Empire, Revolution, and the New Tsar. Very excited to hear from her tonight. From her reflections, given her professional career and her personal connection to former Soviet Union, about the impact of Putin's war on Russia's relationship with the West. Anastasia has agreed to speak to us for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have a nice fat chunk of time at the end to engage with your questions and conversation with her. I know she's eager to have a dialogue with the audience tonight. I want to invite people to throw your questions in the chat. Sergei is going to be helping us to monitor those, and we'll have a chance to respond to them at the end. So with that, it's my distinct honor again, Anastasia, to welcome you, and thank you for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, Bernadine, and thank you, Todd, for inviting me, and thank all of you to take time on this September evening to come and listen to this talk, which for me personally comes from a great place of urgency. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has reshaped for many of us who have connections to Russia, our cultural landscape, and in many ways our identities. So I really truly welcome this opportunity to talk to an audience about the things that trouble me deeply, and also about the things that I believe are super important in for our world and for its future. So again, thank you. And with that, I'm gonna start. I have a presentation for you. So I'm gonna start sharing my my screen, and let me know if this doesn't work, but it should. So here it is. I'm going to, okay. All right, so how is Putin's war on Ukraine changing Russia's relationship with the West?
Anastasia, we're not seeing your slides.
Oh, you're not? Sorry. Let me just, let me try sharing one more time. I was wondering why the layout is different. So, okay, one moment. Share screen. Okay, I think I may have forgotten to hit.
Successful. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you. Good.
Excellent. Okay. All right. One day I will master Zoom, but that day has not arrived yet. But I'm working on it. Okay. So let me frame today's conversation a little bit. I want to talk about this, these things with you, and given the time frame, we might not go in depth into all these issues, but at least I want to kind of point you into the directions of where I myself am thinking. So I want to talk about the place where we find ourselves today in the US-Russian relationship and the larger relationship with the West. I want to talk about how whether the Russians should be held responsible for their government actions in Ukraine and what they think about the war. I want to talk about how the Russian culture, something that I know personally, it has been drawing a lot of people to Russia over, the last couple centuries, and what are we to do with that? How can we separate the culture from the aggression? How can Americans help, and whom should they be helping? And finally, what the future holds. The question that I feel is on a lot of our mind is the return to the good old time possible? So that's my goal for today, and then we'll have questions. So to start, I wanted to sort of give a perspective on what is Russia's relationship with the West has been. And, I kind of want to read it large over centuries. On, the picture you see on the right, I actually live in the Bay Area. So San Francisco has a lot of artifacts that are witnesses to the positive relationship that existed between our nation at the, starting in the 19th century when Russian settlers came to a place known as Fort Ross on the California coast. And of course, we have been, that relationship started changing after the revolution. We were allies during the First World War and the Second World War. And so, which makes this current moment so perilous, I feel, because we're not allies in a global standoff right now. So that's something to have in mind with. But I wanted to kind of point to the bright moments that we had, to the fight in the Second World War, and that picture on the right testifies to that. And but I also wanted to, having said that, I wanted to remind us all that for the biggest part of the 20th century, Russia and the West, and of course, Russia and US have been enemies. And I am sure those of you who are my age and older remember the Cold War and how scary it was. Now, what else is Russia to the West? Russia is, of course, a supplier of natural resources. And particularly in Europe, the reliance has been quite large. And the price of that is coming sort of into the foreground right now when Russia has decided to engage in energy terrorism of sorts, right? When the whole continent of Europe is at risk of choosing between whether to eat or whether to heat their apartments. And finally, these are of course not all the aspects of the relationship, but these are the kind of the highlights for me. And of course, money have been pouring into the West from Russia by very wide rivers. In fact, to the extent, that London has been renamed Londongrad because of how much Russian money and Russian owned property has been there. Of course, there is also Russia. Another aspect of Russia that is sort of its face in the West has been the Russian culture and people like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, but we're going to talk about this a little later. So I wanted to kind of frame what is this sort of relationship of Russia to the West. And with that, I also wanted to say, to sort of introduce me where I fit on this continuum. You know, I was lucky. I was the child of perestroika and of people diplomacy, of Gorbachev and Reagan meeting summits in Reykjavik, of TV bridges where the Russian people were from Leningrad, then Leningrad were asking questions to their American counterparts and vice versa. And there were funny and profound moments during that time. And to me, this relationship, after sort of growing up in Brezhnev's USSR, the twilight of the Soviet times, to me, that was really not only a breath of fresh air, it was the strange thing. It felt miraculous because from my youngest age, I was taught to be afraid of America and of the West and of the imperialism. So it felt like a miracle that this was happening, but it also felt very natural. It felt like a return to normal, and that sort of formed me. This is what I believe is normal of a relationship between the East and the West. And so that sort of shapes my outlook of the world and outlook on the foreign relationship between our countries. And I just wanted to show this photo from a personal archive that was March of 1989 when I met my first Americans back in Krasnodar, Russia. In fact, I wrote a piece about it for the New York Times. Those of you who want to can just Google it. And the Times didn't write the illustration, but you will see it. And so I am the second person from the right, basically for the first time seeing my American people of my age and talking about Raskolnikov and Crime and Punishment and nuclear disarmament and learning the words of Vanilla Ice lyrics. So that was what formed me, and that's what I felt is our new norm. I wanted to point out that that period of time between the beginning of Gorbachev reforms and the arrival of Putin into power was characterized by tremendous goodwill between our countries. As somebody who lectures on Russian politics and culture, I've met dozens of people whose life has been defined by a relationship. I met surgeons who went into Russia to operate for free on Russian teenagers. I met teachers. I met priests who went into Vladivostok in the 1990s. So there was this great exchange of ideas. There were tons of business ventures, and I am one. The reason I am in the United States is because I worked for an Austrian company, and that eventually sort of pushed me towards developing an acumen in business and going to study business in the West. So it worked both ways. Just for perspective of my English group. In my university, of the 14 people, 8 now live in the West, in various parts of the West. So a lot of people left, but a lot of people stayed. And so although back then it seemed like that's how it's gonna be forever, that's not what happened. And that's still is kind of one of the greatest shocks to me, that not everybody felt like my generation felt about the relationship between our country, but most importantly about the collapse of the USSR. Like to me personally, that felt like, the prison walls have come down and you are free. And everything was worth it. The economic hardships were worth it. The superinflation was worth it because you no longer were oppressed by the state. And, I'm not saying I personally was oppressed in any particular way, but just being told what to think, what to believe. Those of you who haven't lived in a totalitarian state, it's a drag. It's not what you what you want to experience, even if you are not sitting in prison. So life was boring, and then it became exciting. But for many people, the collapse of the USSR created also the collapse of identity. We talk about economic hardship, and those were real. I mean, we all watched our savings burn in the money reform, in superinflation and whatnot. So, but those people who were more upwardly mobile and younger, they were better positioned to deal with it. Not everybody was in that cohort. Plenty of people were hankering for the good old times of the USSR. Now, they were not doing it on their own. They actually were told through various messages or by their new government, by the Putin's government, like one of the greatest tricks that he has played is he completely reshaped the historical memory of the 90s and perestroika and our relationship with the West as partners into a completely different story, a story of Russia being forced on its knees by various enemies. And increasingly, though he didn't start there, America and the West were being woven into this narrative of Russia's enemies putting Russia on its knees into sort of the larger state agenda, and with the idea of changing people's mind. And, it's quite impressive because it gives you an idea how the propaganda works, because I have left a country that was sort of a West junior partner in democracy and capitalism. Now, this data comes from 2018, and it shows you whom Russians consider their greatest enemies. And, the picture has only become worse since 2018. Now, this is pre-invasion. 68% believe that their greatest enemy is United States, which is followed the second place by Ukraine, and then EU and the West, and so on. So that is astounding that in our lifetime, we have witnessed the second complete revolution of the attitude of Russia to the West. And in a sense, it's what we're seeing is hypocrisy, right? Because if you look at this chart, and I promise this is the last chart you're going to see, but I think it illustrates the point. Over 40% of Russian GDP is actually offshore wealth that is stored where? Of course, in the West. Despite the threatening rhetoric on the Russian state TV, despite gradually repositioning Russia from being the West ally into effectively its antithesis, that is what you basically see happening through propaganda, through state TV. So despite all that, the luxury properties in New York, Florida, London are owned by Russian oligarchs, by Russian government and their family. So there is this duplicity. Russian women, wives of the government officials, are known to engage in birth tourism because they want to get the citizenship. So all that has been going on, and the relationship has been kind of unhealthy. If we look at it at almost like a family, where things are going off, the worrying signs were there for quite some time. And of course, the annexation of Crimea in 2014 triggered the sanctions and the complete sort of reversal in a relationship where the consulate started closing across both countries. And in Europe, I mean, like I said, in San Francisco had the oldest Russian consulate in America, I believe, maybe even in the Western Hemisphere. And it's on the same church with a big Orthodox church where I used to go. And it's shuttered. And, interestingly enough, before it closed for 3 days, there was smoke rising from that building. So there was no fire, but the evidence, I guess, was being placed into the furnace. So all of that, but again, the relationship still existed, even not in that sort of good-natured format that felt natural to me back in the 90s. So now that I've talked about the relationship now, I want to talk about how the war in Ukraine why the war in Ukraine is a watershed moment for the relationship between our countries. And the reason is that the war is really changing Russian identity and who Russians are. If you are like me and follow, a lot of Russian chatter on Twitter or whatever, recently, I think Michael McFaul, who used to be an ambassador in Moscow during Putin's time, posted on Twitter, I don't know whether the Russians that I have known in the, I believe, 7 years of his stationing in Moscow are the same people. And truth be told, I don't know either, but I'm gradually starting to believe that they're not. And why is that? Well, the war is literally changing the Russia's DNA code. What you see is a picture from my family album. The couple on the left is my aunt and my uncle. My uncle was Ukrainian. Of course, he identified as a Soviet, like most of us, and their kids, my cousins, were the closest play pals and my friends throughout my childhood. Now, I'm not saying it because I wanted to kind of show you my relatives. The reason I'm saying is that about a quarter of Russians have blood ties to Ukrainians. So when you see this fratricide that is happening, that's increasingly actually looking like a genocide, things cannot be as they were, even if suddenly somebody hits a giant undo button and the war stopped, right? This war is going to change Russia, and as such, it must change our perception of it and how we deal with it and how our foreign policy is. Another thing that is very different, which I feel wasn't what I am used to coming from USSR and Russia, is that what we have witnessed over the last few years, particularly since the annexation of Crimea, where sort of this proxy war with the West became really the foreign policy, unspoken foreign policy priority, is that Russians like me, or at least the residents of USSR, were raised with a fear of war. We remember war not just from the movies, which we do because every Soviet citizen had to watch endless movies about the war, but also from survivors' tales. We were raised with this, what you see on the left is a very famous Russian song, which starts with a line, "Do the Russians want war?" And interestingly enough, when I watch the Ukrainian clips from the battlefront, the Ukrainian soldiers, the real heroes of today, are quoting the same songs that we were all raised with, asking, yeah, apparently, and answering it, yes, apparently they do. So that is a huge shift and sort of a social engineering which occurred, and yet another experiment on the Russian psyche. That's what you see is a picture from a typical May 9th parade. has looked as a cult of war for quite some time. And, the mistake which I feel a lot of people made was that, oh, this is just, games. But the militarization of the Russian society has been relaunched, and the rewiring of the nation's brain did occur. Then there is this concept of Russian world or Eurasia, a very strange concept that has been officially or unofficially adopted by the Putin's government instead of Marxism-Leninism. So this is an ultra-conservative ideology that sort of sees Russia as this entity uniquely positioned between the East and the West. And it calls itself Eurasia. And that's where it's a unique civilization, which is neither European nor Asian. And it's a place where Russian culture as envisioned by the Kremlin is actually supposed to be practiced. And you can see that in this Eurasian space is Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and lots of other places that are currently independent, that used to be independent states at the collapse of the USSR. And that is scary. That is the regrouping of an empire, and that is its ideology. All right. So what I want to make sure is that when you hear those words about, Eurasian civilization and Russian world, I want us to understand what the Russian world really meant for Ukraine. And, Ukraine is only one of the many, one of the many sort of targets of Russian expansionism and revanchism. We've had Chechnya, we've had Georgia, and Ukraine is just the next target. But here is what happens to those who, when the Russian world actually comes to a place. So I wanted to play this brief clip for you. And this is a clip about Izyum, which is used to be a wealthy suburb of Kiev. So, as you have seen, it's a scary reality that the war has brought onto Ukrainian land, onto the land with which Russia shares centuries of common past, history, business, demographic ties. And behind this is the ideology of the Russian world, the belief that Russia has the right to own an empire, to rule over nations like Ukraine, Baltic states, and all this is kind of packaged into this idea that this sort of, instead of proletarians of the world unite, as it was in USSR, now it's the Slavs of the world will be united. And that's the reality of what Russia is bringing with what it calls Russian world. It's not bringing a unique civilization. It's not bringing rule of law like the Roman Empire may have claimed. it's bringing destruction, and it plunders. And that's, sort of with this war, which has been probably the first war that has been so covered so much, and we see it all unfolding in real time. We also see what that means for people who are incorporated into the Russian world. So I want to talk a little bit about the subject that kind of concerns me greatly as a Russian, or at least as a person of a Russian origin. How much of responsibility do Russians share for Putin's actions? And I wanted to just briefly tell you that, there is a lot of opinion polls out there that, tell you that 80% of Russians support the war, or I forgot what the numbers are, but they're pretty high. And I do not want at all to sort of whitewash the Russian supporters of the war. There are plenty of them, plenty of people, enough to fill the stadiums that you see that support the war. But those, those polls, when you see them, I would caution taking them at face value, because I remember myself back in USSR, a totalitarian state that Russia has become again. And if somebody called me and asked, do I support the USSR? Of course I will say yes, right? That doesn't mean that I did. I think a lot of people are scared. A lot of people are actually blocking it. But yes, there are plenty of Russians who feel that, who are either duped by the propaganda, or who have sort of taken that drug of greatness. That's the greatness, and the idea of national greatness is a very dangerous drug. And once it enters your bloodstream, it kind of can do a lot of bad things. But I wanted to share with you this quotes. These are taken from the diary of a Russian officer in Kakhovka early in the war. So you can see that what he's saying is that there is a feeling history will call our actions the second Hitlerism and arrange another Nuremberg. I will not brag, guilty, was there, fought there, I'm sorry. And then you see from the same guy, this entrance: by the joint efforts of your humble servant and employee, 12 people were interrogated. All of them are Nazis, meaning Ukrainian. I was ruthless, crucifying them with a cross-examination, individual and night interrogations. So there is this, on the one hand, there is understanding. On the other hand, it's like, I'm just doing my job. I'm an officer and I'm here to liberate Ukraine from the Nazis. There is also a massive disinformation campaign that basically just refuses to call war and refuses to acknowledge that there is war. So there have been protests which have been put down. So people are being put in prison and for so-called discrediting of the Russian army. So it's not as easy to protest the war. I just want to emphasize that people did get real prison sentences for doing that. And so it's just that as a whole, they were not able to stop, to make any impact on the actions of their government. Now, we don't have much time, but I wanted to bring to your attention, if you want to understand this deeper, if you want to watch a movie called Broken Ties, it's available on YouTube and it's with English subtitle. I'm just gonna play like a couple minutes from that movie, and you will, I highly recommend it if you want to understand what is going on, how the Russians and Ukrainians who found themselves on different sides of the barricade are actually, perceiving this. So again, just a quick clip for you.
Увага! Громадяни! Повітряна тривога! Відключіть світло, газ, погасіть вогонь у печах.
Я для всех людей с 24 февраля предатель Родины. Как бы у меня такой статус.
Но это не война. Я не считаю, что это война. Мы не воюем, мы освобождаем.
С моей стороны пришлось им сказать, вы поступаете сейчас как предатели.
Я, например, хотел бы слышать от мамы, да, блин, сынок, тут какой-то пи*** в мире происходит, будь аккуратен. Нет, алло, фашист.
Вынужденные меры или не вынужденные?
Да там русскоязычное население. Зачем их сравняли с землей, только не объяснить. Причем тут, что для Донбасса сейчас это полезного от этого будет? Для нас что полезно?
Ее убедить точно нельзя. Всегда найдутся дяденьки из телевизора, которые лучше знают, как влиять на людей.
Ее же убедить невозможно. Она же не слушает, она же сразу выключается. Говорит, тогда я не буду с тобой общаться, мама, вообще.
So, you know, it's sort of it's a heavy movie, but yeah, and now it's an acclaimed documentary. Like, it got really good reviews. I watched it. I really think it's helpful to understand, if you want to understand like how much this war is changing both nations. And so to go kind of back to this notion of you know, personal responsibility and collective responsibility. We need to remember also that the Soviet propaganda that, you know, current Russian government has mastered quite well during their, you know, stints at KGB and such like organizations are multiplied by modern technology. And you see something like this, instruction manual for Russian troops, on the right, you know, those of you who don't read Russian, it basically goes into various entries into all the truths about Ukraine's crime in Donbass and how the Ukrainians are fascists, how they're, you know, people are being crucified, how people are being beaten because they speak Russian, and so on. So there is this huge propaganda effort that is scaled across the entire society. And the last clip I have for you is this one, is where literally every school in Russia now is supposed to once a week has a lesson about the special operation of Russian heroes in Ukraine. And it kind of gave me goosebumps because even in my Soviet time, I didn't feel that sort of desperate than when I watched this kids.
Слава советской армии!
Армии победителей! Слава советскому народу! Народу победителей!
Кто ваши деды?
Наши деды победители!
Чьи вы внуки?
Мы внуки победителей!
Что такое крест?
Крест — это орудие и знак победы над грехом и смертью.
Что такое страх?
Когда нет любви.
Что такое зависть?
Когда нет любви.
Что такое любовь?
Это же...
So there is the state is making, you know, putting a lot of effort to kind of hold people in the dark. And some people prefer to stay there because the truth is scary. You know, the longer this war goes, the more crimes it commits, the scarier it is for you to understand that you are implicated in death of thousands of innocent people. And, you know, another sort of important thing to remember why, you know, why it's happening is that, you know, war is a social lift for a lot of Russians. That's the sad part, that the average income in Tula, whose residents sort of made front pages of newspapers for the, you know, for being one of the big contingencies in the Russian army, is $300 a month, and army contractors receive $1,200 plus sign-up bonuses. And for many people, that's, you know, that's what they decide, that that's the bargain they wish to strike. And so I know we're kind of running out of time, and I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I wanted to talk about the Russian culture. something that is, a topic that I feel like is important to all of us, because for, a century, maybe, we've been sort of conditioned to look at Russian culture as the front face of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Empire. Russian culture has given the world great writers, composers, scientists, and so what are we to do? Do we need to abandon all that? I mean, on my end, as a person who writes, I mean, luckily I write in English, but in the 2 suitcases that I brought with me to the West were the books of Chekhov and Bulgakov. And so I haven't opened a Russian book since the start of the invasion. I just can't bring myself, not because Chekhov is at fault, but because I feel that we would have to revise a lot of Russian literature and look at it from the perspective, and what's that framework? I don't know yet, but I think a good start would be to look at the work of Russian art or literature from the point of view is how they are promoting or not promoting or define actually the ideals and the state imperial narrative. And those who are, I feel like, it's not like I'm saying we should cancel them. I'm saying we can't look at them the same. But I also want to caution against sort of a wholesale rejection of certain people. Like a lot of times Pushkin now, like is quoted by written a poem that sort of justified, one poem that justified autocratic rule in a sense, but we can't, because he also was behind a lot of poems that roused Russian resistance. On the other hand, Solzhenitsyn became an apologist of Russian state later in life. So it's not as clear-cut how we handle it, but we definitely can, I feel like for us to really re-understand Russian culture, we need to change our perception of Russia. And like my point is that the war has changed Russia. It may have changed it for good, because the reality that people saw in Ukraine are the mass grave and marauding. That too is Russian culture. That's something that as a Russian, shocked me, but in a sense didn't, because I mean, the extent of it did, but yes, violence has always been built into the Russian life. It's been the Russian fabric, the gulags, the wars, they didn't leave the psyche of the nature untarnished. And so we now have to weigh these grim pictures of the Russian world against the contributions of the Russian literature and kind of start sifting through them. So very briefly, I feel, and apologize if I'm gonna take a little bit longer, maybe 5 minutes longer than we agreed, but our current relationship is not great. Russians are being basically canceled by the West. The whole country, its government, it's affecting everyone, including the oligarchs, but it's affecting the regular people who soon wouldn't be probably able, they already can't get multiple entry visas, or it's being worked on. Western companies have left Russia. Monuments of war commemoration role of the Russians have been taken down all over Europe, where they have been standing. So we're in a pretty precarious place. And the Russian pundits on Russian state TV, basically, we have to acknowledge the fact that Russia is at war with the West. It's right now a proxy war, but that we can't be delusional about that. We do have some optimistic news that in general, defeat is very bad for autocrats. And the fact that Ukrainians army has not folded like the Western sources predicted, and it actually has been fighting and pushing Russia back, is actually a very good sign, because Russian autocrats traditionally, from times immemorial, the things start to change when there is a defeat in the war, because strongmen have the message of strength that they build the entire platform on, and they need to remain strong when their constituents, or in Russia the word constituents is irrelevant, when their subjects feel that this promise of strength is not delivered, they kind of start scratching their heads. But I want to caution everybody, it's not like, now I see a lot of articles that are saying, oh, the war is going to be over by Christmas, or Ukraine is winning. I think we have a long road ahead for Ukraine to win, and of course we'll root for them, but let's also sort of be mindful that Russia has a huge military potential, and it virtually unlimited resources for this war. So so to finish, I wanted to basically ask this question: is the return to the good old times possible? This picture again is from my archive, and this shows the meeting of my high school with the Exeter High School back in 1989, when this all felt so hopeful. And the question is, I think for us to return to the old times, Russia must change. Ukraine must win its war, and Russia must understand what it has done, atone for it, pay reparations, and then perhaps it can be accepted back into sort of the fold of a civilization. Until then, it is very hard to envision this, but of course we can't shut it down. We can't just build another a wall around it, because Russia occupies too big of a place on this earth. And so we have to maintain some kind of relationship, whether through student exchanges or through some connection must remain. Otherwise, it's hard to think where it will go. And what can Americans do? Well, I feel like we must do what we always do here. We must vote, because American support for Ukraine is critical. America has been a bulwark of democracy, and its perception in the liberal Russian mind, like my mind, has always been that this is sort of where the buck stopped with democracy. And it has been, of course, greatly tarnished by the 4 years of the previous administration. And so I feel like what we can do, in addition to donating to Ukraine, is to keep politically engaged and civically engaged, and being active. And so I guess my last slide for you, and then we'll open it to questions, are some closing thoughts, which I wrote because I was trying to summarize what I wanted to say. But I want to emphasize that Putin and by default Russia are at war with the West. Russians today are not the Russians of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They are not even those of Brezhnev and Khrushchev. To reclaim its place in civilization, Russia must atone with reparations and demilitarization and illustration. Russian culture must be re-examined. A post-World War II style reformation is the only way, I feel, to return to good old times. And Americans can help Ukraine and Russia by upholding their own democracy. And this is all that I have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and thank you for your time and attention. And I'm going to welcome your questions.
Thank you so much. That was a lot to respond to. It was a very piercing comments, and I'm, you know, really fresh and challenging and disturbing things that you had to share. I'm really grateful for that, your candor and those reflections. To start us off, I'd like to invite my fellow board member at East West Connect, Catherine Galligan, to pose a question. Catherine?
Which would require you to hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. We have with us a Putin expert. It would be interesting for me to hear, and perhaps others, what how much is Putin leading, and how much of is he reflecting what others in the country feel?
Leading, you mean leading the military action? I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, do we blame him more, or is he just reflecting what the people feel toward bringing back?
It's a very, I mean, thank you, Catherine. I do understand your question. And I feel like it's a question that everybody is struggling with, myself included, and a question that has no answers. I mean, yes, I just actually had a piece in LA Times where I compared Gorbachev and Putin, and the argument that I'm making is that the Russians, by centuries of autocratic rule, have been sort of molded into reflecting the identity of their rulers much more than, say, people in the West, because they have, people generally stay less in power here. And yes, if Yeltsin designated, if Nemtsov was the next president of Russia and not Putin, we would have had a very different situation, but that's not what happened. Putin became the next president. He molded the country sort of in his liking, but he also became president because there was certain demand in the society for sort of like this revanchist demand for a strong hand, for order. But how big was that demand in percentage-wise? Did half of Russia wanted it? I doubt it. But there was certain people who kind of wanted the empire back. And when they heard the narrative that, sort of with which Putin started pounding them in sort of in the wake of the Second Chechen War, where this message of strength was very important, in fact, critical for formation of his image, they kind of bit the bullet, and they wanted, some of them wanted to be great again. If you're constantly told that, you've been diminished, Russia has been diminished by the West only wants to come and take Russia's natural resources, but, we've got to protect, and they're expanding NATO. So some people kind of genuinely believed in it. A lot of it, I feel people were basically blocking it and saying, I don't want to deal with politics. I just want to make money, because that's what suddenly they could do. So to sort of wrap up the answer to your question, a lot of blame for starting the war, the blame for starting the war is definitely with Putin, but he's not one man, right? I mean, somebody is actually bombing Ukrainian towns and infrastructure and carrying out those orders. There are plenty of people who actually do support his war, but there are plenty of people who don't. So it's just that most of the opposition to war in Russia, is silenced, and there is no organized or disorganized resistance of any kind. I mean, you can end up in prison for just standing with a white piece of paper. You can get arrested, right? So it's a very difficult question, but let's put it this way: Putin is definitely not helping, right? He started the war. He put Russia on the rails of war, I feel, very early on, with his toughness rhetoric, his sort of rhetoric of pursuing Russia's enemies and lifting it off its knees. And that's where this train dead ends, right? That's greatness is a, like I said, you know, greatness is a very dangerous drug.
Anastasia, you cited Alexei Navalny's "Be Not Afraid" as an anecdote to authoritarianism in Russia. You talked about it, how Americans can be not afraid by voting, and I appreciate that a lot. But say more about why you see that fierceness, be not afraid, as the only way forward for Russia. And what does that really look like when, as we saw, standing with a blank piece of paper in Red Square can get you hauled off?
Yeah, and you know, fear, I feel like if there is one sort of underlying emotion that's common to all, that's very familiar to all Russians, is fear, right? We have a lot of sayings around fear, like, you know, people always fear for the worst. And this has been sort of hammered into us. And to not be afraid in Russia is difficult. You know, it takes a very certain personality to go to protests when you are facing with, you know, real, like, opposition in Russia faces tremendous risks. That, you know, and it has been like that for a long time. But there has always been people like Navalny who just basically demonstrate to the state, but they individual stance. Now that's individual, right? Because sadly for us, and sadly for Navalny, his personal freedom, his ability to stand up and basically say, I'm gonna come, this is my country, and I'm not gonna run away, and I'm gonna sort of go back. It didn't translate into a movement massive enough to bring him to power. So but what is important with those demonstrations of dissent is that in Russia, I feel the state wants to own you. It wants you to basically be completely dissolved in its agenda. It also likes to position itself as sort of like, well, we have common interests. The interests of the state are the interests of the people, and vice versa. And so it kind of wants to subsume everything. And you know, we've seen in this video that I've showed, like, how widely its tentacles reach, right? I mean, it goes into kindergarten. But always there are people who basically stand up, whether they were dissidents in the Soviet time, or whether they are people like Navalny who stand up and say, you don't own me. I am not gonna bend. And yes, they are an inspiration, but I want us also to, you know, understand that this acts of individual freedom and fearlessness so far failed to cause a regime change. And most change in Russia comes from the top. You know, that's the reality of it. So even though it's always, you know, great to see those individual examples of courage and freedom, they're just not enough to turn the tide.
I see Todd has interjected himself here as our clock watcher, and I want to thank you so much for your reflections tonight. Really appreciate your being with us. Todd, you have some final comments and announcements for us?
First of all, I want to thank Anastasia, absolutely brilliant. And the program will be up on our website and our social media, hopefully by next week, for use in classes and for those who basically haven't had a chance to see it yet. And believe me, many people should see this. I want to thank Bernadine for her moderation, not in terms of being moderate, but being, you know, of handling a wonderful discussion. I want to thank our sponsors, the Russian Studies Department of Macalester College, the Museum of Russian Art, Global Minnesota. We've got a number of upcoming programs that are outstanding, I think. On Wednesday, October 5th, we have the brilliant and wonderful Margot Squire, along with Ross Wilson, the Ambassador Ross Wilson, and Tom Hansen, discussing the future of diplomacy, which is basically a very critical issue at this moment. On Thursday, October 27th, we've got one of the leading economists in the United States, Raymond Robertson from Texas A&M, And he and I have just done an article on the costs of the war, which will hopefully be out in a book this fall. And on Wednesday, November 30th, Michael Wright and others will discuss the role of disinformation in the world. In January, we're planning for a 4-day cultural festival with the Forum for Cultural Engagement in New York. And we've got other programs and activities that will hopefully be announced by next week. So I want to thank everyone who took the time to watch this. It was one of the best programs we've done. And I'm really proud that.
Interject it's a pleasure. It's been really great. I realized that I kind of ran late and that there are fewer questions that I was able to answer, but do feel free to reach out to me, whether on my Twitter account, you can find me, or through my website, where if you hit the contact me form, I'll be happy to answer more questions or engage with you. So just wanted to put it out there, and sorry to interrupt, but I know we're on time, so I wanted
No, listen, that as we said, there's always time for Jello. There's always time for somebody who is as brilliant and wonderful as you are. So spasibo большое. Thank you, and have a good night. And hopefully, God willing, by the next time, there'll be more peace in the world. That's what we pray for. Thank you, and good night. Пока.
Good night. До свидания. До свидания. Спасибо.
Пока.